Afternoon, everybody. I know people are still joining. I can see people coming in now, but we're just on 12 o'clock, so I'm going to get started with our session today. Hopefully, those of you that have joined already can see the slide on the screen that I've put up there, which is our welcome slide. Thank you. Lots of thumbs up. That's helpful. But my name's Sarah Taylor. My role is that I'm the business manager for the Safeguarding Adults Board and also the Children's Partnership in South Gloucestershire. If you've been to any of these other webinars during the week that we've been running, you'll have met the business managers from all 5 of our Safeguarding Adults boards, and this is our final session. So I'm just welcoming you all today on behalf of all 5 of the Safeguarding Adults board in the Avon and Somerset footprint. We've got a great turnout, and we have had for all of the sessions. And what we'd ask is that you just turn off your camera and your microphones for this session, because there's such a lot of people in the room. We sometimes get a bit of feedback and it changes things. And also we're recording the session, so you might not want to have your face showing all the way through the session in the recording. Questions are welcome, but we'd ask that you just put your questions into the chat. So use the chat function, because there's too many people to kind of come off mute or put your hand up, that kind of thing. And I've got a couple of people, Sophie and Joanne, who are just going to monitor the chat just in case there's anything that comes up. There is an option in Microsoft Teams to use live captions or subtitles that you can switch on for your own individual use. Only you'll be able to see them. They won't appear for the whole group, but that might help with accessibility. And then thinking about writing in the chat, just to let you know that anything you write in the chat will be visible to everyone in the meeting. So just to bear that in mind as you're writing your question. The session, as I've just said, is being recorded today, and all 5 of the workshops that we've run over the lunch times of this week have been recorded, and in the next few weeks those will all be available on the Keeping Bristol Safe Partnership website. So your local Safeguarding Adults board will send you the links, that you'll have the links available to access those recordings. So if you want to watch anything again, or if there's something that you missed, you'll be able to do that. And then lastly, at the end of this session today, there'll be a little evaluation form to complete, and there'll be a link put in the chat for that. Not that I'm competitive, but obviously I'd like the most evaluation forms from this session. So I think the record is 30 through this week, and that's way lower than the number of people who've been attending. So if you could help me win the evaluations, then please do give us your feedback. And if you've been to a session earlier in the week and you didn't evaluate, you can do that today, because it's the same evaluation form. So just when you get that link, just open it and pop that in the chat. I'm just going to put a little bit of extra information in the chat now about this session. So I think we just need to have a little bit of a sort of health warning about today, really. We're thinking today specifically about safeguarding adults reviews, and by the very nature of that, the adults that we're talking about have either been seriously harmed or have died. And so I just invite you to look after yourself today as we're thinking about this topic. It's possible you'll know or recognise the adults that we're talking about if you've worked with them in the past. Please don't share any identifiable details about them in the chat or anything like that if you do know them, but also feel free to just step away if you think actually this is not okay for me on a Friday afternoon. So and the other thing to say is, I know during the week, each time I've looked in the chat, people have said, will the slides be shared? And I'm really happy for the slides to be shared after today, so we'll send them out to everyone in the group if that would be helpful. Okay. So I'm going to start off with a couple of polls, and we'll see if these work. What should happen is, when I launch the poll, on the middle of your screen, you should get a question that you can answer. If you don't, I'll read out what the question says so you can write in the chat if it's not showing for you. I know sometimes when we have big meetings like this, sometimes there'll be somebody outside of South Gloss Council, where I'm hosting this from, might say, oh, they can't see them. So we'll use the chat as well. But here's the first poll, and this would be quite useful for us as we think about our session today. So I'm just launching it now. And the question is, have you ever been involved in a Safeguarding Adults review as part of your role? So it's a quick yes or no that would help me to be able to see what your current experiences are. If you can't see it and nothing has come up on your screen, just pop in the chat like a couple of people have. We'll get an idea of the experience in the room from this. So on my screen, I've got 55% of you are saying yes, you have, and 45% no. And then I can see there's a lot of things coming in the chat as well. But that's really interesting that there's, in fact, just going up a bit, but there's quite a lot of you in the room who've been already involved in a SAR as part of your role. So I will not spend too much time. I'll spend a little bit of time explaining when we undertake SARs and what happens, but not too much. So I'm just going to launch another poll. So I'm just asking you now, and you can write in the chat if it doesn't come up. If you think about all the SARs that you've ever seen or heard about, what keywords spring to mind? So what do you think about when you've read a SAR or you've been involved in a SAR? What are the key things that spring to your mind? And this will come up like a word cloud. So as people start typing words, we should see some of those, and I'll read out things that are coming up on the screen for those of you that are not able to see it. And again, if you can't see it, then do feel free to pop that in the chat. So we've got some things in the chat about repeated themes that come up, that you feel sad about them. Yeah. And then on the screen, I've got self-neglect big in the middle. I completely agree with that. And then there's other things like about there being a tragedy, about the Care Act, about missed opportunities, about multi-agency working and communication. Abuse is one of the things you think about, yeah. But on the word cloud in the center of the screen, self-neglect is coming up really as the biggest. So lots of you have obviously typed that in, which is really interesting as we go through today. Thank you for doing that. And then I've got one final one. And this final SAR is, I want you to name something you have learned from a SAR that you have read in the last year. So something you've read in the last year, name something you have learned. About good recording, about agency communication and communication being key, about multi-agency working, about giving feedback, ask and act. I really like that. Understanding of the Mental Capacity Act. There's a couple of people have written about that. About our systems. Better sharing. Oh, I really like that, Mandy. The need to speak out until you're heard. Yeah, to speak and advocate on behalf of someone. Okay, thank you so much for doing that. It's really hard to make it interactive when there's so many of you, but I just wanted to hear a little bit from you at the beginning of this. I think hopefully you can see my slides because they disappeared partway through that for me, but I've reshared them. So I just want to remember, sometimes when you think about safeguarding adult reviews, you think about the fact that there might be a long report, there might be lots of paperwork to read if you're involved in the SAR, and at the end you might be looking at a report, a lot of words to read. And I just want us to really focus on what SARs are about, and that people and not cases are at the heart of all of our reviews. And that's why I put that bit in there at the beginning, which I said about looking after yourself, because actually it's not a happy way to spend a Friday afternoon. I realised when we'd put this one last. So do look after yourself as we're talking about these. And as I said, feel free to step away if, at any point should you need to. So what I've got this afternoon for us is I've looked at 5 safeguarding adult reviews that have been undertaken across Avon and Somerset footprint in the last year, and 5, well, they've been published, so some of them go back a bit further, but they've been published in the last year. And I've chosen one from each of the 5 areas in Avon and Somerset. There were more than 5 that were published, but I've chosen 5 to kind of spread across the region. And the purpose of doing this, the purpose of having this session today, is that sometimes we can be involved in a SAR and we know a lot about the SAR that we're involved with, or there might be one published locally to where you're working, and you get maybe a learning session about that where you work. But we don't always hear about the Safeguarding Adults reviews that take place just across the border from where we're working. So we thought it was quite important for us in this Safeguarding Adult Week to think about what have the reviews been like, what have the themes been like across our region. So we'll think about 5. Obviously, we've got a really short amount of time. And that in that time, we're going to not have be able to go into much detail about the safeguarding adult reviews. So it is possible that you'll listen to me and think, oh, there's so many other things, Sarah, that you could have said about that SAR if you've been involved. And I completely agree, there will be. It was really hard to kind of narrow it down so that we could look at 5 all in a very short space of time. But what will happen is that Joanne, who is supporting me today, is going to put later on, she'll put in the chat links so that you can go and read the reports, or some of them are full reports, some of them are like executive summaries that were published, and you'll be able to go and read those for yourself if you want to get a little bit more information afterwards. So to start with, I just wanted to think a little bit about when we undertake a SAR and what that is. And I know there was quite a few people, just under half of you said you hadn't been involved in a SAR before. And so I thought it'd be helpful to just remind ourselves of where the legislation comes from and when we undertake a safeguarding adult review. So it comes from the Care Act. And we undertake a SAR when an adult dies as a result of abuse or neglect. Sometimes we know that someone has been neglected or that there's been abuse, but sometimes it's just suspected. And there has to be, as well as that, there has to be concern about the way partner agencies worked and whether they could potentially have worked more effectively to help protect that adult. And then we also can have safeguarding adults reviews when the person is still alive but has experienced serious neglect or abuse. So you'll see in the SARs that I've chosen today, one of those adults is still living. And obviously that's slightly different, the process that you'd undertake, because that person might want to speak for themselves when the review is underway. Then there's the bit in green at the bottom there that says there's another part, section 44.4 of the Care Act says that safeguarding adult boards can also arrange for a SAR in any other situations involving an adult in its area with needs for care and support. And we often call those discretionary SARs. That's the sort of terminology that's used. So where I'm based in South Gloucestershire, we've undertaken a few of those, and they've usually been a much shorter review. We've maybe done a learning event and then published like a learning brief for professionals rather than employing an independent reviewer and getting a report at the end of that. But all of the 5 SARBs will do things slightly differently, but all of them will use this as their criteria for undertaking a safeguarding adult review. And this is a little snapshot of the process of what happens when there's a SAR. So it always begins with something happening to an adult and a referral that comes in. Referrals for safeguarding adult reviews can come from any practitioner from any organisation. If they're worried about whether something might have met that criteria, that there might be abuse and neglect, and that there's concern about the way agencies have worked together, all 5 of our SAAWs have got referral forms where you can refer in. It's also possible that a family could make a referral about a safeguarding adult review. We've had an experience of that in South Gloucestershire, and I'm sure the other boards have too, where a family member is worried about what happened to their loved one and makes their own referral. So there's usually a subgroup, like a safeguarding adult review subgroup of some sort. They might have slightly different names in the different boards across the region, but there's a subgroup who will make a consideration of that referral. And then once that consideration has happened, there'll be some information gathering, and they make a recommendation to the independent chair of the Safeguarding Adults Board in the area where that adult lived. That then the chair then agrees or not with that recommendation. If they agree and it's decided that there should be a review, then that's when a safeguarding adult review will start. It's important to say that when we're looking at reviews, we're always looking at not blaming people. We're not looking at like who did what and who did it wrong, and what can we learn from the mistakes. And sometimes as a professional, if you're suddenly asked to be involved, you might feel like you're going to be criticised or blamed. It should never be about that. It should always be about learning. And actually, safeguarding adults reviews are looking for the good practice that you do, as well as anything that we could have done better. Usually there's an independent reviewer, not always, but usually there's somebody independent from the local area who comes and is the lead for that review and who writes the report. We always try to have family engagement in the review. So I mentioned just now about an adult who had survived, who might be the subject of a review. They might want to be involved and tell part of their own story to the reviewer, but we'd always contact, even if the person has died, we'd want to be speaking if they want to, and if at all possible, we'd want to be talking to the family about their experience of working with organisations with their loved one. There's usually a panel or a review group who support the independent reviewer as they're writing their report and looking at all of the information that's been submitted. And then Safeguarding Adults reviews have their kind of quality assurance and sign off as part of a Safeguarding Adults board. There's usually Safeguarding Adults boards publish their reviews. Sometimes they publish like a shortened version if there's a worry about identification of the adult. Often if it's possible that we've had a situation in South Gloucestershire where the person would have been very identifiable and their family, and we made a decision that we wouldn't publish the full review, for example, but we have a principle that we'll aim to publish because we want learning to be shared and for people to learn and change their practice as a result of what we found out. So after publication is a really important time. Sometimes it can feel a bit like, oh, well, we finished it and it's published and that's the end. But actually, that's only the beginning, because we want there to be an opportunity for professionals and organisations to learn from what's happened in the review. So the focus of today is on 5 adults. We've got 5 Safeguarding Adults board in the Avon and Somerset area, and then a staggering 1.72 million people live in that area. So if you're in a role like mine, it can feel a bit like there's a lot of reviews, but actually when you look at the Avon and Somerset footprint, in the last year there were 11 published reviews out of that huge number of adults, of people who live here, and we couldn't look at all 11 today, but there will be a link that take you to the place on each board website where you can have a look at the reviews if you wanted to look at all of them. But we're going to focus on, thanks, Joanne's just put that in for you. So we're going to focus on 5 adults today. And 1 from each area. So let's start looking at them now. So the first one, this is a SAR about a man called Peter, and Peter will be like a pseudonym. It won't be his real name. Usually Safeguarding Adults reviews are anonymised, not always, but usually they're anonymised. So I think it's important for us to have, for each of these people, to get a sense of a little bit of who that person is. I said at the beginning, this is about people's lives and not about not just about like a case. So although we're using these as case studies, these are real people and real families. So Peter was brought up in the southeast. He was living in Somerset at the time when he died, and his sister talks about him being a bright, happy little boy when he was a child. He had some difficulties in his adolescence where he was excluded from his education provision, didn't complete college courses, and had a long history of substance misuse. Unfortunately, he became really increasingly estranged from his family, and there became longer and longer gaps between communications with his parents and his sibling. But we do know that he got married and has a son who's still alive, but who lives abroad. And then the professionals who work with Peter say that he had a really good sense of humour and on a good day could be excellent company. He was really interested in current affairs, he was well informed about world events, and he was interesting and funny and a well-read person. Sometimes I think when we're thinking about reviews, we just focus on like the things that happen to the person, but I think it's really important to get an idea of, you know, their personality in reviews as well, and to know a little bit about that person. So Peter died in 2022, and the Safeguarding Adult Review was published just fairly recently, September 24. And it's interesting that when I asked you what words you think about when you think about reviews, the predominant thing that came up on that little word cloud was self-neglect, and Peter's story includes self-neglect in it. And just from personal experience of what we've seen in South Gloucestershire and referrals that come in, they don't all meet the criteria for a SAR, but we do see a lot that have a theme of self-neglect, and there's been a lot of that across the country, not just here in our sort of local area. So there had been an extensive history of self-neglect at home, and then when Peter moved ultimately into a care home, his self-neglect continued. There was quite a lot of hoarding in his, he had a lot of hoarding behaviours, and also quite a lot of antisocial behaviour towards professionals and anybody who wanted to provide him with care and support, really. So at the beginning of COVID, when we first had the restrictions in March 2020, Peter began to complain of pain in his ankles and feet. He didn't want there to be a full examination. He didn't want there to be very much treatment of that, but it sort of treatment had to focus on pain relief because of what he would allow. There was a really big deterioration in 2021, and ultimately that sort of refusal of treatment led to him having gangrene in his feet and legs. So Peter had 5 hospital admissions over the next 8 months until his death, and it was particularly challenging when Peter didn't want to go into hospital, or would want to come out of hospital and wouldn't want people to treat him or look at his injuries. Peter's mental capacity to make decisions weren't formally assessed, despite the fact that it was known he lacked capacity in other areas, like in his finances, for example, but there wasn't an assessment of his capacity to make decisions about his health and medical treatment. And then communication, when he went back into his care home, there wasn't great communication between the hospital and the care home for continuity of care. So there were some complicating factors around alcohol and potentially some financial abuse that had happened for Peter as well. So thinking about the learning in Peter's Safeguarding Adult Review, there's a really important key bit of learning around the fact that we need to make an assessment of mental capacity for an adult, especially if we know that there's been a lack of capacity identified in other areas of their life. That's really important. There's also some learning about needing a clear pathway to seek legal support. So for professionals to have like good legal literacy, and understand what the options are and what they can do and where they can get extra support. There's something around the decision to open or close a case being only based on capacity and making sure that doesn't happen. And this, you'll see this is a recurring theme, that use of multi-agency escalation policies. All 5 of our Safeguarding Adults board in Avon and Somerset have a version of an escalation policy that's for all agencies. It might be called a resolution of professional differences, or it might be called escalation, but there's one in every area. And there's a really big theme across these 5 that about the use of those documents and people knowing when they can escalate and how to escalate. So I'll talk a little bit about that at the end too. And that making sure that when someone is transferring care, maybe from hospital to care home or care home to care home, or domiciliary care agency to a residential setting, that safeguarding information is clearly shared. So that's our first Safeguarding Adult review. And Joanne's just put a link in the chat if you wanted to read more about Peter, the full SAAW. So we're going to move on and think about Brian. Brian is a Bristol adult. And Brian, his little pen picture is that he was a PE teacher. He also spent many years of his life abroad, like Peter in the previous one. He's got 2 children, a daughter who lives abroad and a son, Alan, and Brian lived alone in a 1-bedroom flat that he owned. He had some physical health conditions, so he was paralysed from the waist down. And in 2016, Alan, his son, moved into the flat to take care of Brian. There was a package of care agreed, but Alan decided to care for him, and the SAR found that Alan's view was that was because of the cost of the care, that he felt it was too expensive, and so he would do the care himself. Brian died at home in 2021. He was 81 when he died, and he did die of natural causes. But the Safeguarding Adult Review captured these things that are on this slide. So there was a preference between Alan and Brian to use natural therapies instead of sort of traditional medical responses. It's difficult to know whose preference that was in my reading of this Safeguarding Adult Review. Agencies a lot of agencies had raised concerns about potential neglect by Brian's son. There were things like, there were some issues like there was no hot water in the flat, it was damp. And sometimes Brian would be left for quite long periods without food or water. And one of the ways that his son managed to get his dad to shower or to get dressed was to withhold his food or drink. So he wouldn't be allowed to have a drink until he had done the thing that his son needed him to do. There were 7 safeguarding referrals from agencies, and there was also a big pattern of hostility. There were mention of staff having to visit in 2s, in pairs, to go and visit because of the hostility, and there was declining support being accepted, not declining support being offered, but declining support being accepted by the family. When Brian went into hospital, he had a stay in a nursing home, and all the therapy and care like that was repeatedly declined by the family. This SAR also found that there was a bit of a lack of Brian's voice. His son's voice was really easily captured by professionals, and his son spoke for him, but it was difficult for professionals to hear Brian's voice. They were in such a small space, a 1-bedroom flat. To speak to Brian by himself was really challenging for professionals, and his voice wasn't captured very well at all. So these are the sort of key learning bits about this adult. So we've got the balancing of choice. Obviously, anybody is free to choose what kind of treatment they'd like, but that balancing of choice between alternative and conventional treatments when they're available, and how difficult that is, and also again thinking about the use of the Mental Capacity Act and in that approach as well. Engaging with carers and making sure that carers are always offered a carers assessment. And there was a bit of a risk in this SAR of people having like stereotypes about the carer, and that might influence a professional's perception of a carer. And there's also that risk of carer burnout and carer stress when somebody is taken on full caring responsibility for someone when there was a package available. There were some carers going in and out for Brian, but the son obviously took the bulk of that responsibility. There's learning about coercion and control for professionals, and I think that's really important because we often think about that between a like a marriage or a partner relationship, but this is with an adult and their child. So but there was a coercion and control involved in that situation, so learning about recognizing when someone is being coerced. The bit about making safeguarding personal is really about making sure you've heard the adult's voice, and again knowing when to make a safeguarding referral and when you should escalate. So that's the same, those two, that kind of hearing the voice and making safeguarding personal and being able to escalate and knowing how to do that are really key in lots of these reviews. So the next one that we're going to look at is a young woman called Adult K in the Safeguarding Adult Review. This one is a South Gloucestershire Safeguarding Adult Review. So one that I was personally involved with, rather the other ones I have read and looked at for this presentation today, but this one was a South Gloss one, so I know the most about this young woman. Adult K, her parents were still around. She is young. She's 22 when she died, so she is a much younger person, much younger adult than the others that we've looked at. Her parents were separated, but both were supportive of her, although she sort of flitted between them a little bit and lived independently too. She'd had quite a challenging childhood. There was some sexual abuse, there was some inconsistent and chaotic parenting, some substance misuse by a parent, and she was also diagnosed with ADHD when she was 15, and had medication for that, which her mum said made her like a different child. But as she got older, she chose sometimes to self-medicate with other substances and not with her ADHD medication. She was really bright. She was a graduate in psychology. She was studying with the Open University, and you can see on this slide how the professionals described her. She is friendly and bright and engaging, really likable, affable, really insightful, and she often was, after she'd been in a crisis, often fueled by alcohol or other substances, she would be hugely embarrassed at what had happened and have a huge amount of regret about the incidents she has caused and what had happened with her. She did use alcohol and drugs to excess, and that sort of triggered a series of crises for Adult K, and she had really frequent multiple interventions by emergency services. And as I said just now, she was only 22 when she died. So Adult K actually didn't die in South Gloucestershire. She died at Victoria Station in January last year. And you can see on this slide like the amount of contacts that she had with different professionals. So there was a huge amount of police contacts that she was often found either by railway tracks or on motorway bridges, and also she overdosed a number of times. So she had a lot of contact with the emergency response services. Just between July and October in 2022, she had 28 ambulance calls. You can see the huge number of police contacts that she had in those two periods there, and 37 detentions under the Mental Health Act. There was some really good practice of a high impact user plan that the emergency departments, mental health, the police and SWAST all shared. That was like excellent practice, that they had a plan of what would happen when Adult K came into contact with their services, which really improved things for her. but the learning for adult K, one of the key things was that it's in that green box at the end, is that I mentioned that adult K didn't die in South Gloucestershire. So although there was a really good plan in place, when she left this area and went somewhere else, so she wound up in London, obviously that plan wasn't available to the professionals there, and they didn't know the plan that was in place to try and support her, which obviously, had they known, that would have really helped them to understand the best ways that adult K could be supported. She had a diagnosis of something called emotionally unstable personality disorder, and we've done a bit of work in South Gloucestershire helping professionals to understand that disorder. But one of the professionals said that it can lead to like a bit of a lack of hope, because you think, like, I don't know how I can help this adult, and so we've done a little bit of work. We had a presentation from the mental health team in South Gloss, helping to understand what that might mean for someone and how to work with them. We know that adult K, because of her behaviour, she was sometimes the instigator of trouble, as well as experiencing harm and abuse from others. And she had an exclusion order because of her behaviour for one of the emergency departments. There was provision for her to go to a different one, and she wasn't excluded completely, but obviously that was difficult for her. But also, she wasn't registered with a GP at the time that she died, so she'd kind of was finding that difficult to connect. She had a real lack of engagement with services outside of the crisis. So when she was in a crisis, she would accept lots of help, and then as soon as that had ended, she would discharge herself and not want the support in between. Professionals talked about the risk of compassion fatigue with somebody who's repeatedly coming into contact with your services over and over again, multiple times a week. And there was also a lack of referrals to safeguarding, because she was sort of seen as this was mental health, not a safeguarding, and that was some of the learning too for adult K. So, and I'm sorry this feels a bit whistle stop going through sad stories of people, but I will try to pull us back at the end. So Colin, which this is a North Somerset safeguarding adult review. There's actually a picture of Colin on the front of the review, so I've used it here. I said at the beginning that often reviews are anonymised, but for Colin, the family obviously chose to use his name and shared a picture of him, so it helps us to get an idea of who Colin was. His family described him as being really active. He walked and cycled. He had a diagnosis of Parkinson's disease, which frustrated him, but he still did loads of things. So his son talks about them laying a floor together just 3 months before he had a stroke. He was a bricklayer earlier in his life, and he was described as being thin and wiry and really strong. He'd been a single parent to his children since his divorce, and that was when they were very small. The children were 4 and 6, and his family said he was a real family man. His son said he'd never met anyone so multi-skilled in his life, and it describes all the things that he used to do with his dad in the review. And his daughter also had a really positive relationship with her dad and saw him like multiple times in a week, and at the weekends. They spent a lot of time together as a family. Colin, in his Safeguarding Adult Review, he suffered a stroke in May 2020, which led to severe long-term disability for him. At the end of August 2020, thinking about this being in COVID times, he was under the Discharge to Assess programme. He was discharged to a dementia care home and was assessed there as not having capacity to make decisions in relation to his care and support needs. In 2021, Colin died. He died by suicide, and he had regularly expressed his desire to go home, and specifically had been saying that he didn't want to live in a dementia care home because he didn't have dementia. So when we look at the learning for Colin, Colin's learning is around that person-centered practice and making sure that we communicate with the adult, find out what they do, what their wants are, what are their wishes, what can we do to support them, and listen to their voice and their family. Knowing when to make a safeguarding referral, especially when somebody has made an allegation of harm, That wasn't always clear to the staff. There's some learning about the quality assurance of pathway 3 beds, and how people are allocated to them, and quality assuring them, making sure they're the right place for the right person. There's some learning about making sure people have got therapeutic support as part of their hospital discharge, and also the understanding and review of the do not resuscitate forms, that when somebody is admitted to a residential home, and the understanding about what first aid staff can do when someone has, like, following self-harm or a suicide attempt. And for staff, there was some confusion about what they could do and should do, or what they shouldn't do, because of the do not resuscitate that was in place for this adult. So last one. And thank you to Joanne, she's putting the links to them so you can find out more about each of these adults. So this is the last one, and this is Adult C. This is a Bath and North East Somerset review. And this is the one where I said at the beginning not everyone had died. So Adult C is still alive. She describes herself as being happy and having a normal family life and a successful career prior to becoming unwell. She's degree level educated and was employed up until 2014. And she left that position due to her own decline in mental health and physical health. The practitioners who worked with her said she was intelligent, is intelligent and articulate, and knows and speaks her mind. She's married, and her and her husband and other family members participated in this safeguarding adult review, that's great practice when we see the family involved. All of these safeguarding adult reviews, apart from Adult K, had family involvement, and Adult K's family chose not to be involved because it was too distressing for them, I think, really predominantly. So in this one, these were some of the things that were highlighted. So there were concerns about the potential failure of organisations in their duty to prevent ongoing harm. And because of that, Adult C now has some long-lasting physical and mental impairment. She was bedbound for a long time, and there was significant self-neglecting behaviour. And since her rehabilitation has started, her well-being has improved, but she is left with significant physical disability. So the learning for this adult is thinking about that parity of esteem between mental health needs and physical health needs. Sometimes one of those can dominate the other, and there should be like a parity of esteem for those. Again, that hearing the voice of the adult is really important. Considering mental capacity, some of these themes have come up through these 5 safeguarding adults reviews. Another one here about legal literacy, and we saw that in the first SAAW that we looked at as well, about professionals knowing when to get legal advice, knowing what their legal options are and understanding that. Again, another incidence where there was an impact on the carer, and that opportunity to have a carer's assessment that we should be doing when there's a family member who's a carer. The use of an independent advocate, even when there are close family members involved, an adult is still entitled to have an independent advocate, and we need to make sure that we are always offering that. We found in South Gloucestershire, we found repeatedly in our multi-agency auditing that advocacy are not included for adults that were entitled to have an advocate. So we should always think about that when we're working with an adult who has entitled to advocacy. And then there's also some learning about understanding the escalation pathways, that resolution of professional differences or escalation, and professionals not always knowing when and how they can escalate. So these are the things that I've pulled out as being themes across those 5 safeguarding adults reviews. You all have pulled out your own themes, I'm sure, but there were themes of self-neglect, which is not a surprise because that's prevalent in lots of the referrals that we see for safeguarding adult reviews. There was a theme about mental health in several of those. A theme about escalation, I think, in all of them. So that's really pertinent that all of those safeguarding adult reviews had times when professionals could have escalated but weren't necessarily confident about how to do that. Um, about physical health needs as well as mental health needs, and neglect and concerns about family care. For one of those in particular, coercive control is a theme that comes out in one of those. That dual diagnosis of mental health and substance misuse, and being able to identify when there should be safeguarding referrals. A suicide theme for potentially for two of those adults, although for adult K, it's not clear whether that was an intentional act, that adult K thought that she was ending her life on that day. And then the other theme that I think is really key is that hearing the voice of the adult and making sure that we hear them and their views and what they want to say, and we make all of us in our work with adults make sure that we hear the voice of the adult. So I'm just going to launch a poll. I feel like I've talked for a long time, and um, I'm going to just ask you to do something for a moment. So the poll this time, and feel free to write in the chat if you can't see it. So it says, what is the key message you will take away from these 5 adults today? So either type in the little box if it's popped up for you, and if it hasn't, have a look in the chat and write the key message you think you will take away from these 5 adults. So we've got the voice of the adult is really big in the middle of the word cloud. Escalation, the fact that people are at the center, the adult's voice, professional curiosity, listen to the adult, joint working. I think that I can share these word clouds afterwards when we send out the presentation. So I'll see if I can download them and share them so that you can see them, especially if you couldn't see them on the screen as we were talking. So what will I do differently, I think, is the key question. So like the what is like the initiative, that's the SAR, the Safeguarding Adult Review I said earlier, is just the beginning. The so what is what significance it will have and what we will do differently because of the learning. And the now what is the how do we embed that fully into our practice, the next steps. So in the chat this time, everyone in the chat, I'd like you to just think for yourself about one thing that you will do differently as a result of hearing about those 5 adults in your role, whatever your role is. So just spend a moment now in the chat recording something that you think you will do differently as a result of hearing about these adults. I'll just give you a moment to do that. So we've got 2 so far, one that says about listening to the individual, one that says about offering everyone advocacy, slowing down to take in the whole picture for someone. If somebody's written what you were going to say, feel free to just kind of like their comment instead of feeling you have to type it again yourself. Signposting for advice about getting advocacy. Yeah, I haven't got that in links to send out to you, but we can do that for each of the 5 boards to know where you refer for advocacy. So I'll do that. I'll take that as an action for myself. Trying to understand how the carer is feeling. Lines to legal support are clear, making sure that we've got lines to legal support, absolutely. Pausing and reflecting, taking time. Not being afraid to escalate. reoffering a carer's assessment if someone has declined it the first time. Yeah, I think not being afraid to go back and revisit things and say, I know we didn't want to then, but like, is it something you'd like to think about now? Yeah, not being afraid to ask questions. Not being afraid to escalate. Like, let's not be workers who are afraid. Let's take action on behalf of the people that we're working with. I think sometimes I'm just going to move on to the next slide. So there's a couple of things that stood out to me really strongly. One was about escalation, and that thinking about the fact that when something hasn't happened the way that we thought when we were worried, we should go to our routes of escalation and use the escalation policy. There's definitely an escalation policy in all 5 board areas that's multi-agency, and Joanne's got the links, so she's going to put those into the chat for you. I might have missed them, she might have done it already, but all 5, but there they are. All 5 boards have got escalation policies. I know that North Somerset's is a joint one, and that's something that's being reviewed, but it's still there for you to use with a route to escalate. And I think we need to get away from the feeling that escalation is about complaining about a partner and we need to work together well. It's not about complaining about the partner. It's about making sure that we do the best for the adult that we're working with and checking out and challenging one another well, without being afraid that, you know, we'll spoil our working relationships or something like that. It's not about that. It's not about making a complaint about another agency. It's about working well together and making sure that we get the right support and the right outcome for adults. So if you're not clear or you're not sure or you don't think the right decision has been made, then you can and should try and resolve that through the processes that are in place. And the other key thing that I took away from those 5 SARs is about listening to the adult voice. We've all got a voice. We all want to be heard. And so do all of the adults that we work with. They all have things that are important to them, and we should work hard to try and understand what those are, to know about that adult. So sadly, in Safeguarding Adult Review, sometimes we only see what the adult wanted afterwards, but it would be like really important for all of us to take away from today that we need to be clear what the adult views are. It's one of our principles, isn't it, about making safeguarding personal. We can't do that if we don't hear the adult's voice. And so I have deliberately not run till 1 o'clock today because I was really aware that as you've sat and listened to these, like, it's pretty depressing sometimes to just think about the sad things that have happened. Most of us work with adults and do, like, things work for them, things get better for them. We see positive change, and our intervention makes a difference in adults' lives every day, and we need to hold on to that. If you remember at the beginning when I said how many people live in Avon and Somerset and how few SARs there are, actually today we've just really focused on some of the times when things didn't go as well as they should, but I don't want you to go away from this thinking like, oh my goodness, that was a bit grim for a Friday lunchtime. So I just want us to finish a little bit early. There is an evaluation form that Joanne's just going to put in the chat. There it is. Please will you just click on that and give us a little bit of feedback about today and any of the other sessions that you've attended in the week. And then in your kind of 5, that will take you 2 minutes. And then in your 6 minutes that you've got left after doing that, please go and get a cup of tea and look after yourselves, and just give yourself a few minutes before you kind of rush into the things that you've got to do this afternoon. So just on behalf of all of the boards, thank you for joining in with the workshops that we've run this week in Safeguarding Adults Week. Have a good rest of the day and a great weekend.